I want you to understand who my wife is before I tell you what my son's wife did to her. Elaine is not the kind of woman who asks for help. She never has been. She raised 2 kids while working part-time at the school board office in Barrie. Drove an hour each way in February snowstorms without complaining once, and still managed to have dinner on the table most nights by 6. When my mother was sick, really sick, the last 2 years before she passed, Elaine drove out to Aurelia every single weekend to sit with her, do her laundry, bring her soup from scratch. Not because anyone asked her to, because that's just who she is. I say this so you understand that what happened last Christmas wasn't about a difficult woman who finally snapped. It was about a good woman who had been quietly taken for granted for 3 years, until the morning a list arrived on her phone that made her sit down at the kitchen table and go completely silent. I'm going to tell you exactly what was on that list. But first, let me back up. Our son, Kevin, married Stephanie in September of 2021. The wedding was beautiful. Outdoor ceremony near Collingwood. Weather held, everyone cried at the right moments. Stephanie is organized, driven, works in marketing for a tech company downtown Toronto, and I say all of this without malice. She is not a bad person, but she has a way of managing situations, people, schedules, outcomes, that can feel less like collaboration and more like a directive being handed down. The first Christmas after they got married, Elaine offered to host. She cleaned the house for 2 days, made a full turkey with all the trimmings, baked 3 kinds of squares, and had everything ready by 1 in the afternoon. Stephanie arrived with a bottle of wine and a comment about how she'd found this amazing caterer in Yorkville if we ever wanted to take the pressure off next year. Elaine smiled and said that was a lovely thought. The second Christmas, Kevin and Stephanie hosted at their new place in Mississauga. Elaine brought 2 dishes, a roasted squash soup and a butter tart tray she'd been making since Kevin was in middle school, and spent most of the day helping in the kitchen while Stephanie directed traffic. When Elaine went to plate the soup, Stephanie redirected her to the living room to keep the guests company, and quietly put the store-bought bisque on the stove instead. Elaine noticed. She didn't say anything. I noticed too. I also didn't say anything. That's something I've had to sit with since. By the 3rd year, a rhythm had developed. One of those rhythms that nobody explicitly agrees to, but somehow becomes the expectation. Elaine would do the cooking. Elaine would bring most of the food. Elaine would clean up after, and Stephanie would host, which mostly meant she chose the table settings and sent a guest list. This past November, about 6 weeks before Christmas, Elaine got a message from Stephanie. I was in the garage when Elaine came to the door. She had her phone in her hand and a look on her face I'd only seen a few times in 31 years of marriage. That very quiet, very controlled expression she gets when something has genuinely floored her, and she hasn't decided yet how to feel about it. She said, "Come read this." I wiped my hands on a rag and followed her inside. The message was long. It started warmly. "So excited for this year. It's going to be such a special one." And then transitioned smoothly into what I can only describe as a catering brief. Christmas dinner this year would be at Kevin and Stephanie's place. 30 guests. Stephanie's parents were flying in from Vancouver. Kevin's firm's junior associate and his wife were also invited, because apparently this had become a work event as well. The message laid out, in point form, what Elaine was expected to prepare and bring. Whole roasted turkey, minimum 18 pounds. From scratch, not a grocery store rotisserie. Gravy made from the drippings. Tourtière, 2 full pies because Stephanie's mother had mentioned she loved it, and Stephanie had told her Elaine made the best. Mashed potatoes, enough for 30. Real butter, real cream, no substitutes. Glazed carrots with maple syrup and thyme. Brussels sprouts with pancetta. Green bean casserole. Cranberry sauce, homemade. A charcuterie board, assembled and ready to serve on arrival. Dinner rolls, homemade if possible. A full cheese tray with accompaniments. Yule log cake. Shortbread cookies, 2 dozen minimum. And, I want you to read this carefully. The message ended with, "Mom, you're such an amazing cook and honestly the secret weapon of every gathering. We'd be lost without you. Can you plan to arrive at 9 so we have time to get everything set up before guests come at 2? Kevin will help you carry things in from the car. 13 items, for 30 people, for a dinner that also included her husband's work colleague, and Kevin's contribution was carrying things in from the car." I read it twice. Then I looked at Elaine. She was already at the coffee maker, her back to me, very focused on something that didn't need that much focus. I said, "Elaine." She said, "I know. You're not doing this." She turned around then, and she had that look, the one where she's already run through the whole scenario in her head and is 3 steps ahead of wherever I am. She said, I haven't answered yet. Good, but Kevin sent his wife to manage his mother, I said. That's what happened here. She sat down at the table, I sat across from her, and we talked, really talked. For the first time in probably longer than I'd like to admit about the pattern we'd both been watching, and neither of us had named out loud. The soup that got quietly replaced with store-bought. The time Elaine offered to teach Stephanie her butter tart recipe, and Stephanie said she'd love that and then never followed up. The Easter where Elaine spent 4 hours at their place getting lunch ready, while Stephanie took her mother to a spa in Oakville. 3 years of small moments that, individually, could all be explained away, but stacked up into something that had a shape. I asked Elaine what she wanted to do. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, I want to go somewhere. I didn't say anything. I waited, not here, not Barry. Somewhere that isn't about managing anyone else's Christmas. I said, okay, where? She thought for a second. Remember Pat and Linda? They moved to Nova Scotia, Cape Breton. They'd been asking us to visit for 2 years. I did remember. Pat Gorman. We went to high school together, lost touch for a decade, reconnected at a mutual friend's retirement party in 2019. He and Linda had bought a place in Baddeck the year before the pandemic and never looked back. They'd extended the invitation so many times it had become a standing offer. I said, I'll call Pat tonight. Elaine looked at me like she was checking whether I meant it. I meant it. Pat answered on the second ring. When I explained that we were thinking of coming out for Christmas, a week, maybe a bit more, he was quiet for half a second, and then he said, finally, and I could hear Linda in the background saying, tell them yes right now. We booked the flights the next morning. Air Canada, Barrie to Toronto Pearson, then straight to Sydney, December 23rd to January 2nd. Done. Then Elaine typed a reply to Stephanie. I watched her write it. She wasn't dramatic about it. She wasn't cold. She said, Stephanie, thank you for including me in the planning. I have to let you know that Gordon and I won't be able to make Christmas dinner this year. We've already made other plans. I hope you all have a wonderful celebration. We'll arrange to see Kevin and you in the new year. That was it. No explanation of why. No inventory of grievances. No guilt. Just a simple, complete sentence that closed the door. She showed it to me before she sent it. I nodded. She sent it. Then she put her phone face down on the table and said, let's have tea. So we had tea. The response from Stephanie came within 4 minutes. I know because Elaine glanced at her phone when it buzzed and then put it back down without reading it. She told me later it said something like, oh no, is everything okay? We were really counting on you. Is there anything I can do? The warmth in the message had a particular quality, the kind that arrives only after the request has been declined. Kevin called that evening. I picked up. He was confused at first, then concerned, and this is where I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, something closer to sadness than anger. He said, Dad, Mom knew how much this meant to Steph. It's a big year for them with the Vancouver family coming. I let him finish. Then I said, Kevin, your wife sent your mother a list of 13 things to cook and bring to her house, for 30 people, including your work colleague and your in-laws from across the country, and the plan was for her to arrive 4 hours early. On Christmas Day. Silence. I just want to make sure we're describing the same situation, I said. More silence. And then, I didn't know it was that many things. I believed him. That was almost worse. You need to know what's going on in your own home, I said. I tried to say it without sharpness. I don't know if I succeeded. Your mother doesn't say much. She never has. But that doesn't mean she's okay with everything. Kevin said he understood. He said he'd talk to Stephanie. He sounded genuinely shaken, in the way you are when you realize something has been happening right in front of you and you looked away. We said goodnight. I went to bed and Elaine was already there. Reading, she asked how the call went. I gave her a summary. She nodded, turned a page and said good. The weeks between then and the 23rd were quiet. Kevin sent a couple of texts, checking in saying he hoped we had a good trip, not mentioning Christmas directly. Stephanie sent nothing. Elaine responded to Kevin warmly and briefly, and didn't volunteer more than he asked. We packed 2 weeks before we left. Elaine bought Linda a bottle of local Ontario wine, and a small cedar box she'd been saving for a good occasion. I got Pat a book I knew he'd like. He'd mentioned last time we talked that he'd been reading more history since slowing down. It felt good, buying gifts for people who hadn't sent us a catering order. The morning of the 23rd, we drove to Pearson in the dark. It was the kind of cold that makes the inside of your nose sting, -18 with the wind, and the highway was dry and clear. We had coffee from a thermos. Elaine had a window seat and watched the runway lights while we waited for de-icing. She looked relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in a while, and I realized, somewhere over Georgian Bay at 30,000 feet with the sun just starting to show at the edge of the sky, that I hadn't planned this to send a message. I'd done it because my wife deserved one Christmas where she was a guest. Cape Breton in December is a specific kind of beautiful that I wasn't prepared for. The roads to Baddeck wind along the edges of the Brasdor Lake, and the water was steel-colored and still, with snow just starting on the hills. Pat met us at the door in a flannel shirt with a glass of something in each hand, and Linda had the house smelling like wood smoke and something with apples. We stood in the doorway for probably 30 seconds just breathing it in. Christmas Eve, we sat up until nearly midnight around their kitchen table. Linda made rapai pie, traditional Acadian dish, chicken and grated potato, nothing fancy and absolutely perfect. Pat opened a scotch he'd been saving. We talked about the years we'd lost touch and the years since, and Elaine laughed, really laughed, the kind that folds her forward, at a story about Pat's first attempt at lobster fishing with a neighbor's gear in October. Christmas morning, Linda made crepes. There was no agenda. We sat in their living room and watched snow fall on the lake and opened small gifts and drank too much coffee and didn't apologize for it. My phone was on silent. Elaine's was in her coat pocket in the front hall closet. Around 2 in the afternoon, which I knew from Stephanie's original message, was when guests were scheduled to arrive at their house in Mississauga. Kevin called. I heard the ringtone from across the room. Pat and Linda tactfully moved to the kitchen. I looked at Elaine. She looked at me. I let it go to voicemail. Kevin called again 7 minutes later. Elaine picked up the phone this time, looked at the screen and silenced it. She put it back in her pocket and said, "More coffee?" I said yes. The voicemail was brief. Kevin's voice was a little strained, somewhere between frustrated and something softer that he was trying to contain. He said the dinner was, he paused, a bit chaotic. He said, Stephanie's mother had asked where Elaine was, and it had been awkward to explain. He said he wished we were there, and he hoped we were having a good time. I listened to it that evening after dinner, standing in Pat's back porch looking out at the dark water. The wind off the lake was sharp and clean. I texted Kevin back, "We're in Cape Breton, having a wonderful time. Happy Christmas, son. Let's have dinner when we're home." He replied with a thumbs up, and then, a few minutes later, "I love you both. I'm sorry things got complicated. That was the part that mattered." I didn't show Elaine the texts until the next morning. We were sitting at Pat's kitchen table again, second coffee, snow still coming down. She read them. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she set the phone down and wrapped both hands around her mug. "He's going to be okay," she said, not as a question. "Yeah," I said. "He will." We spent the rest of the week walking along the Cabot Trail when the weather held, playing cards with Pat and Linda at night, eating leftovers and fresh bread and sea-salted butter from a local dairy in Waikikoma that Linda had discovered. On New Year's Eve, the 4 of us stood on their front porch at midnight and listened to the silence over the lake, which in Cape Breton in January is the kind of silence that feels full rather than empty. Elaine leaned against me in her wool coat and said, "We should have done this years ago." I put my arm around her. "We're doing it now." We flew home on January 2nd. The house was cold when we got back. We'd turned the heat down before we left, and I got the furnace running while Elaine unpacked. She made soup from what was in the freezer, and we ate at the kitchen table and talked about nothing in particular. The comfortable talk of 2 people who've been somewhere together and don't need to explain it. Kevin called 3 days after we were home. He wanted to have dinner, just the 4 of us, not a big occasion. He said they had something they wanted to talk about. We met at a place in Barrie we'd been going to for years, corner booth, good bread, the kind of restaurant where you can actually hear each other. Kevin looked tired in the way that sometimes means someone has been doing some hard thinking. Stephanie was quieter than usual. She'd brought flowers for Elaine, tulips, yellow, not the kind of gesture that erases anything but not nothing either. They said they wanted things to be different going forward. Stephanie said it more directly than I expected, that she'd put too much on Elaine without asking whether she wanted that role and that she was sorry. Elaine thanked her. She was gracious and genuine and didn't pile on. That's who she is. Walking back to the car afterward, I held Elaine's hand in the parking lot. The temperature had climbed back up to almost zero, practically a heat wave for January in Barrie, and the sky was that clear, hard blue you get in the middle of winter. She said, "I didn't need an apology." I looked at her. "I mean, it's nice, but I didn't need it." She thought for a second. "I needed the trip." I squeezed her hand. "Me too," I said. And it occurred to me, driving home on the bypass with the heater finally working, and a country station playing something low, that the best decisions aren't always the dramatic ones. We didn't send a letter. We didn't make a speech. We didn't call a family meeting. We just chose ourselves for once, and quietly, without anyone needing to say it aloud, everything shifted.